Three things that people, even Christians, might not know about the Bible. One, the Bible is historical. What does it mean when we say that the Bible is historical? You know, you hear that all the time. The Bible's historical, right? So what does that even mean? All that means is that the standards that a ancient document has to pass through, the tests, if you will, the bibliographical test, the internal evidence test, the external evidence test, all of those tests that every single ancient document goes through, the Bible passes with flying colors. It does exceptionally well. It dwarfs the competition, if you will. It does better than most, if not all, other ancient documents, particularly the New Testament. So when we say that the Bible is a historical document, that's what we're saying, that there is no evidential reason to say anything otherwise. The only reason why anyone would say that the Bible's not historical is basically because they don't like what the Bible says. It has nothing to do with the evidence. It has nothing to do with the documents themselves, with the dating, with textual, any of that stuff. None of it. The only reason why is if they don't like what it says. Bottom line. It's not because there's no evidence. It's not because there's no extra biblical evidence. It's not because there's flaws in the manuscripts. It's because they don't like what it says. Now, people can say, we can't take this seriously because we don't believe in miracles. Or people can say, we can't take this seriously because it's not politically correct. But nobody can say we can't take the Bible seriously because the evidence says we shouldn't. Nobody can say that. Another thing that people might not realize or consider, even Christians, is that Jesus literally was a man, okay? He was alive. He wore clothes. He got hungry. He had to use the bathroom. When he was a baby, he threw up on his mother. He was a man. He was a human, okay? Now, the reason why I say that a lot of Christians might not know that isn't necessarily that, they don't know it. They don't consider the reality of the fact that Jesus was what I am. He was in this place. He walked this earth. He had troubles. He had trials. He experienced heartache and heartbreak and abandonment. He was a human. Okay, so how do you know this? Well, the Bible's a historical document. We already covered that in the first half. So as a historical document, there's no reason to think that any otherwise, right? The historical document says so. So you might say, oh, well, that kind of sounds a little bit like circular reasoning. Well, the only way that can be circular reasoning is if you judge the documents contained within the New Testament in an unfair bias. Unfair bias, what do I mean? Well, how can you say that Napoleon was a real person? How can you say that Alexander the Great was a real person? How can you say that Socrates was a real person? Plato was a real person? How can you say that these people were real people? Because we have historical documents that say they are, right? You can't take historical documents that talk about Alexander the Great and his life and his accomplishments. You can't take those documents and say that's circular reasoning by using them to say that he existed because they're what says he existed. It's not circular reasoning. You can call it circular reasoning if you want, but it doesn't make it circular reasoning. There's really not much more you can say. Actually there is, which brings me to my third point. There are numerous extra-biblical, non-biblical, outside of the Bible references to Jesus and his life within the time frame of his lifetime. I'm not talking about stuff from hundreds of years later. I'm talking about stuff from within 100 years of his life. That is extremely rare as far as history is concerned. We just don't have it. We just don't have that stuff for Alexander the Great and the Caesars and Plato, and we don't have stuff as close to their life. Their stuff is hundreds of years from their life, but Nobody questions whether they existed. Yet here we have the existence of Jesus called into question time and time again based off of what? Not the reliability of the documents, because if these documents aren't reliable, then those documents aren't reliable, and nobody questions whether those documents are reliable. Jesus actually walked the earth. There's extra biblical documents to support that. It's not just a fanciful claim. It's not just wishful thinking. These people weren't just people that needed something to believe in. Let me tell you something. There was plenty of choices. They didn't need something to believe in. They had hundreds, possibly thousands of choices. Nobody just invented Jesus because they needed something to believe in. And the extra biblical documents support that. Now, what do we have? We have a Jewish historian, Josephus. If anyone had a reason to say that Jesus didn't exist, it would be the Jews. They hated Jesus, but they didn't say that. They said, we had him put to death. They didn't say he never existed, because they can't. They can't get away with it. If they could, I'm sure they would have, but they can't. Even hundreds of years later, and I'm talking the Babylonian Talmud in the 5th century, talks about Jesus. They don't say anything good about him. And Josephus doesn't say anything good about him either. He's a Jew, but he's a Jewish historian, right? So he records history, and he mentions Jesus. He mentions James, the brother of Jesus, and okay, so that's that. Now, another one is Pliny the Younger. I'm like, was this guy, you have a baby face, the Younger. He was a Latin author. One of the great contributions from him was that he recorded in his works that Jesus was the object of worship. And this is like around 100 AD. And one of the reasons this is important is because there's an accusation that, the Christians didn't worship Jesus. That was inserted hundreds of years later. No. Okay, it wasn't. And Pliny the Younger, who has no reason to support the Christians, to back them up, he's just recording. He's actually recording the ill fate of them. He was talking about when they were arrested, they would be found singing songs of praise to this Jesus as if he were a god. That just does away with the whole idea that was invented hundreds of years later, and that wasn't really the case. That was the case, all right? A third one is Tacitus. Now, Tacitus was a Roman historian. Tacitus had a reputation for being meticulous, for being accurate, all right? And Tacitus was no friend of the Christians, all right? The Romans hated the Christians, and they persecuted them. Tacitus writes of how Nero would soak them in oil and impale them in his racetracks and light them on fire as torches for his racetracks, right? So, these were no friends of the Christians, and they didn't say that Jesus never existed. You would think that would be a good argument, right? Yeah, your boy Jesus, he's not real. So why don't you just swear allegiance and worship Caesar, and we can just call us a day, right? They didn't do that. They didn't say that. They didn't say that Jesus never existed. They said, we killed him. That's actually exactly what Tacitus writes. That Jesus was crucified at the hands of Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Now that's accurate, and that coincides perfectly with what the gospel says. It is completely historically accurate, and there's no reason for it to coincide with what the gospel says, other than the fact that it's truth. So that's that. The idea that Jesus is a myth or any of that stuff, it's modern. And by modern, I mean in our times. It just wasn't something that was said because you couldn't say that, because there were people alive who knew that it was true. You couldn't get away with saying that. You can now because of ignorance, but you couldn't then. The bottom line is that the Bible's historical. Jesus is real, and there's plenty of extra biblical evidence to support that. So there you have 3 things that many people may not know, even Christians, about the Bible.